Good evening. My name is Evan Gregory, and this is Bible Answers. We're going to be starting our study in the book of Acts, chapter 14. And feel free to follow along. I have all the verses here on the screen here. And as always, it's brought to you by North Columbus Church of Christ in Columbus, Mississippi. And you find out more about us on our website, northcolumbuschristians.com. Also, we have a YouTube page, which is North Columbus Church of Christ. Get on there, subscribe, and all of these videos. If you miss something, or if you want to maybe show these videos to someone else, you can subscribe. You'll be notified, and these same videos that you're seeing now will be there on YouTube. And so we finished up chapter 13 last week, and if you recall, they were in Antioch, and they were run out of Antioch. Uh, Folks didn't like their message that Paul and Barnabas was bringing forth. Ultimately, they didn't like the gospel being proclaimed to them, didn't believe those things, and so they run Paul and Barnabas out. And so we see that they go from Antioch, and that's kind of a small map there. The letters are at least small, but if you see the orange line, the beginning of the orange line is Antioch. So this is where they were at in chapter 13. And so they're moving to Iconium, which you notice if you just follow along that orange line, it is to the southeast. And so that picks us up in verses 1 through 7. And before I start that, let's go back to that map just to kind of follow along through chapter 14. They will be moving from Iconium down to Lystra and into Derbe, as you can see on the map here. And so, beginning in verses 1 through 7, they make their way to Iconium, and we see there it says they went together to the synagogue of the Jews, and so spoke that a great multitude, both of the Jews and of the Greeks, believed. So this is their really what Paul and Barnabas do. That's really their plan. When they enter into a town, if there's a synagogue there, the first thing that they do is enter into that synagogue, and rightfully so, that the Jews would know of the Messiah, Jesus. They would be able to put two and two together. And so it would make sense that when they would come into some town that may not know of Jesus, or they're beginning their ministry, that they would first visit the synagogue of the Jews and tell them about Jesus. But sometimes some of the Jews believed, but a lot of the times many of the Jews did not believe. And we see here that says that the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brethren. And so they're speaking the good news, and then the Jews come along and speak ill against it. It says that they are poisoning their minds against the brethren. They're doing whatever they can to keep them from following the message of Paul and Barnabas. And so, anyways, regardless of that, it says, therefore they stayed there a long time, speaking boldly in the Lord, who was bearing witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. So they're speaking boldly, even in the midst of people being against them. They're being run off from towns. They're being persecuted. They're still staying the course. It says they're still speaking boldly. But notice they were speaking the word of the Lord, but also the Lord was bearing witness, as the writer puts it, to the word of his grace, so that individuals can have God's grace through his word. And so God is bearing witness to this word. How? We've talked about this before. How does he bear witness to his word? By the signs and wonders. He is granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. So this is how God shows, hey, what these people are saying is real, that it's legitimate. So they're speaking the word, they're performing miracles and wonders. And we see as we keep on reading, says the multitude of the city was divided, part sided with the Jews and part with the apostles. And when a violent attempt was made by both the Gentiles and the Jews with their rulers to abuse and stone them, they became aware of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, city of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding region, and they were preaching the gospel there. So, again, kind of a running theme here that when people start speaking the message, people get fired up against it. The Jews didn't like it, and so they had divided the city. That the part were with the Jews, part were with the apostles, and then they finally, those that were with the Jews that were against the apostles, they come try to stone them, and they're run out of town again. and it says that they go to Lystra and Derbe. And so again, we just saw this map here, so just follow that green line. Again, it's kind of hard to see, but they go south from Iconia to Lystra, and then further southeast to Derbe. And so while they're in Lystra, it says a certain man without strength in his feet were sitting, a cripple from his mother's womb who had never walked. This man heard Paul speaking. Paul, observing him intently and seeing that he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, "Stand up straight on your feet." And he leaped and walked. Now, when the people saw what Paul had done, they raised their voices, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." And Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was a chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose gates was in front of the city, brought oxen and garland to the gates, intending to sacrifice with the multitudes. This is kind of it's kind of a interesting and funny story, at least in my mind. And so Paul goes to Lystra, and we don't see him, immediately going into synagogues. But what we do see is they continue to perform miracles and wonders. We see Paul here, this man who had never walked, and notice what this man was not. He wasn't just crippled, or it wasn't some individual that nobody had known in that area. This man was known. He was crippled from his mother's womb. Okay. And so this wasn't some scheme. Wasn't some plan. Paul trying to, maybe trying to make something up, maybe act like he's performing these things when he's actually not. This is someone who's been crippled from birth, and we see where he commands him to stand up straight, and he leaps up and he walks. And we see that the people, when they see this, these individuals, assumingly they follow these various gods. These are, I think, if you ever studied any Roman or Greek gods, these names Zeus and Hermes would be familiar. I don't know exactly who they all are. I know that they're pretty on up there as far as all the gods, but they think that the gods have come down to earth, that the gods have come down into the likeness of men. And so they call Barnabas Zeus, Paul Hermes, and so that they're thinking a great thing is happening, and really a great thing is happening. That Paul and Barnabas, they're performing these miracles, are coming there to preach the gospel, and the people misinterpreted. And we see here that the priest of Zeus is actually fixing to sacrifice because of what's going on. And so listen to what Barnabas and Paul had to say about this in verses 14 through 18. It says, "But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard this, they tore their clothes and ran among the multitude, crying out and saying, 'Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men with the same nature as you, and preach to you that you should turn from these useless things to the living God, who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all things that are in them, who in bygone generations allowed all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he did not leave himself without witness, and that he did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. And with these things, they could scarcely restrain the multitudes from sacrificing to them.'" So, uh, sometimes you read in the scriptures of individuals that when people are saying, "Hey, you're a great person, you are something," that people will just accept that they will approve of those things, and may even agree with what's being said, but not Paul and Barnabas. So these people are thinking that they're gods, and they say, "No, we're not. We're just like you. We're men with the same nature to you, but rather we preach to you the living God, the creator, the one who made the heaven and the earth." And it says that he made everything. He allowed all nations to walk in their way. So they have the choice to do wrong or do right. But he didn't just walk away. He continued to give witness. And how he gave witness was through the very creation that he had made. That through the seasons, through having adequate food, being able to raise that food, that through that, someone ought to be able to tell that, hey, there is some creator, there is something else out there. And Paul Barnabas says this is a witness of God actually being who He is. And so, even though they try to keep them from doing these things, they try to tell them, "Hey, we're not Zeus, we're not Hermes." The people, it says, they could scarcely restrain the multitudes from sacrificing to them. They just still kind of going crazy that they apparently don't, which is very interesting that they think that they're Zeus and Hermes. They think that they're gods, but apparently they're not really listening to what they have to say. They're continuing on with what they have already planned to do. And so, just a very interesting story, and it's important to see what effect that these miracles have on these individuals. And although again these miracles are witnesses for the Lord, that people see them, people think that they're marvelous, but at the same time, people can just misinterpret what's going on. They still may not get the point there. And so it's important for us when we're looking at these that still, I mean, we understand the rule for these, but don't, but we still have to understand the word. We still have to do a little reading of our own to make sure that we're understanding exactly what the will of the Lord is. And so moving on to verses 19 through 28. So if we go back, so they're in Lystra. So let's go back. So in verse 8, it says that they're in Lystra. And if you recall in chapter 13, that they were in Antioch in Pisidia. Okay, so this was close to that Lycaonian area. There is another Antioch in the Syrian region, which is north of Israel, which would be what at least what I'm more familiar with, and I think what you would all be familiar with in most times when people are talking about Antioch. But they're in Antioch and Pisidia. They have problems there. They go to Iconium. But notice, while they're in Lystra in verse 19, it says here that the Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there, and having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. So it's not enough for the Jews here to, you know, run Paul out of town from Antioch or from Iconium. They actually follow him. Apparently, they catch wind of where he's going. And so they come there. And what's the first thing they do? Well, same thing as always. That they get him. It says they stone him and drag him out of the city, and they think they stone him so much that they actually think that he's dead. Okay, they think that they're done with him. They think that they killed him, but notice they're not quite. And he says, however, when the disciples gathered around him, he rose up and went into the city. And the next day, he departed with Barnabas to Derbe, and so he's probably knocked out from this stoning. They think that he's dead, and says that eventually he rises up. Okay, and what does he do? Well, the next day he goes to Derbe, and which again I think is fascinating of the just the will, the fortitude, the strength that Paul has here. That he almost died. People were trying to kill him, but it seems like he just brushes it off and keeps on going here. And so he goes to Derbe, and I don't know. I mean, it's not a short walk from Lystra to Derbe. And so he goes, and what happens? Well, he continues to preach. He goes and preaches to the city. It says they made many disciples in Derbe. And then he goes back to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch. Okay, so they run him off, and he says, well, they're not going to get rid of me that easy. So he makes his way to Derbe, and then he turns around and goes back the way he comes. And notice what he's doing. He says he's strengthening the souls of the disciples there. So the persecution that Paul and Barnabas faced there, those that believe, I mean, it seems as though they're suffering like Paul did, being as to what he says to them. He says he exhorts them to continue the faith and saying we must through many tribulations enter the kingdom of God. That it's not going to be easy. That if you're following Christ, there's going to be people that hate you. Jesus himself says the same thing. And so those that are truly following me, it should not be a shock to anyone if they suffer. All right. And so many preachers today will say, well, if you follow Jesus, you're going to be rich and wealthy, and a lot of people are going to like you. And that's totally 100% false. In actuality, uh, more likely it's going to be the exact opposite. If you're really doing the right things, there's going to be people that don't like you. Okay, if you're following Christ, you're going to suffer for that. And so he tells them this, and they appoint elders in every church, and so these are really the leaders of each congregation. You can read in Titus and in First Timothy the qualifications for these elders. That they're kind of, again, they're kind of the head of those. Well, not Christ being the head of the church, but at least the those that are kind of the heads in those congregations are those elders. They're kind of head up that organization of the church. And so he points to elders, he prays, and he commends them to the Lord. And so after this, they're making their way back to the Antioch in Syria. And so they're making their way back to where they came ultimately. And so they make their way down to Perga. They go to Attalia. It says from there they sail to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work which they had, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work which they had completed. So they started in this Antioch. They sail, eventually making their way to this Antioch in Pisidia. Go to make their way to Lyconium, Lystra, and Derbe, make their way back, and then go back to Antioch to Syria. Okay, so it's kind of confusing, but they just make a note, 2 Antiochs, and so they go back to Antioch where they had left. I believe it might have been in chapter 12 or beginning of chapter 13. I can't remember that, but anyways, they leave, and it says they come back there. They report all God had done with them, and he says, and that he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. So they stayed there a long time with the disciples. So they had completed that work, and they come back and they tell those that he had been with previously of all the things in which he have done. And so it's really a narrative here, really telling what Paul and Barnabas has done, through their journeys. But you notice these common themes that there's people believing, but they also face people who are against them, right? That they're working against them, but they continue on regardless of that, even to the point where them almost dying, and they would be willing to continue their work even if it did cost them their lives. And so that's all I have for this chapter. Hope that it's been useful for you. The next point of time, Lord willing, we'll start in Acts chapter 15. But again, I think it's just impressive what Paul and Barnabas is doing, the faith that they have, and their just determination of completing the work that God had given them. So if you got any questions or comments, feel free to leave them. And as always, even if you watching afterwards, leave a question or comment. And until next time, I hope that you all have a good day and a good rest of the week. Thanks.